Hi, everybody. This is Ashley Maready, the Curator of Collections and Exhibitions for the Erie Canal Museum in downtown Syracuse, New York. I'm glad you decided to join me today. Our museum is still closed to the public due to the COVID-19 pandemic, so we've moved a lot of our programming online and to digital forums. We're promoting things on our website and our social media pages, and if you're enjoying the work that the museum has been putting out these last couple of months, please support us at this difficult time. I will put a link in the comments section below. So today we're going to be discussing an outsized American character and his work with canals. Theodore Roosevelt, who was a native New Yorker, helped to shape the fortunes of two canals, the New York State Barge Canal and, of course, the Panama Canal. So we'll begin today with a general overview of the history of New York Canal specifically. We'll discuss Theodore Roosevelt and his path to American distinction, along with how his domestic and foreign policies shaped the history of man-made waterways. And then we'll talk about the two canals influenced by Roosevelt's work and how they came to be, along with the current status of these waterways, because more than a century after their original construction, they still hold a place of prominence. So let's get started. New York itself would not have become the Empire State if not for the creation of a major man-made waterway. There are three different iterations of New York's Erie Canal, and a lot of the museum's visitors are new to this history, so just in case you are as well, I always like to give a little overview at the beginning of my talks. The 19th century Erie Canal proved to be an inspiration to the creation of other canals, so you can appreciate the importance of this history in the context of today's talk. The construction of the very first original canal began July 4, 1817 at Rome, New York. It officially opened in full on October 26, 1825, although individual sections were open to use as soon as they were completed. For example, the section including Syracuse opened in 1820. The original canal spanned 363 miles across the state from the Hudson River at Albany to Lake Erie at Buffalo. It was 40 feet across and 4 feet deep. This slide has a map of canal branches constructed by the year 1829. And this is a really handy one that shows when different sections of the canal were completed. The elevation changes across the state had to be overcome by the construction of locks. Locks are sort of like elevators for boats. If a boat needed to move upstream, it entered the lock chamber, which is filled with water to raise the level of the boat. Then the lock gates are opened and the boat is released. To go downstream, the process is reversed, with the water level being lowered. This is how boats cross the state of New York over areas at different elevations. There's 570 feet worth of elevation change to reckon with, and the original canal had 83 locks. The most extreme example of elevation changes can be found at the western end of the state, where the LOCKPORT Flight of 5 locks were the engineering marvel of the day. The original Erie Canal has a politically motivated nickname that you might hear referenced occasionally, Clinton's Big Ditch. We use this nickname in an affectionate way at the museum, but at the time of construction this was a dig at then New York Governor DeWitt Clinton, who staked his political fortunes on the canal and was in fact first elected to New York governorship in 1817 on his promise to get the canal built. The plan to create the canal was regarded by many, both in New York and in the country overall, as a pipe dream and, quite frankly, impossible. So Clinton took a lot of political heat for the plan and was even briefly voted out as governor during construction. He did have the last laugh, however. He was reelected, and when the canal was completed on October 26, 1825, DeWitt Clinton traveled aboard a boat called the Seneca Chief as part of an expedition across the entire canal. They left from Lake Erie at Buffalo, taking with them barrels of lake water, and upon reaching New York Harbor and the Atlantic Ocean, Clinton poured the Erie water in, wetting the waters, so to speak. So pretty much as soon as the canal opened, it was immediately too small to accommodate the level of traffic that it attracted. Enlargement projects on the canal began in the 1830s and lasted through the 1860s, with the resulting larger canal in use until the early 20th century when it was closed. The canal was increased in size to 70 feet across and 7 feet deep, allowing for larger boats to use it, and 11 locks were removed in the process, taking the total down to 72. Along with enlargements and improvements, lateral canals were built. This ended up servicing nearly all areas of New York State, as you can see in this map. Both the original and enlarged canals were movers of people and ideas along with cargo. A lot of people, including immigrants from Europe, traveled on the canal to the interior of the country. A lot of the museum's visitors actually come from the upper Midwest on the Great Lakes, and in talking to them, I found out that a lot of their ancestors traveled there by way of the Erie Canal. The canal was responsible for the spread of a lot of new ideas as well, including political and religious movements, and during its peak years, the livelihoods of over 50,000 people depended on the canal. The enlarged canal was closed in the early 20th century and subsequently filled in many places, including through downtown Syracuse. This is a photo of Clinton Square, with the canal being filled in process. The current canal system is popularly known as the Barge Canal, and this is the American canal influenced by Theodore Roosevelt. I'm going to go into a lot more detail about its conception and creation as spurred by Roosevelt a little later in this talk, but I'll give you a very brief overview now. This canal system was constructed beginning in 1905 and eventually opened in 1918. It spans 524 miles and includes 4 branches, the main Erie, along with the Cayuga-Seneca, Champlain, and Oswego canals. It uses natural waterways, like lakes and rivers, across most of the state. These have had locks added to them. In some parts of western New York, however, there aren't suitable natural waterways, so those canal sections are man-made. They were constructed at a minimum width of 120 feet across and a minimum depth of 12 feet. The system has 57 locks in total. And here is a nice map by the Canal Corporation that shows the current system. And a historic postcard image of Lock 24 in Baldwinsville, the closest lock to Syracuse. So I want to give you some biographical details about the man in question before we move on. I have to say that TR is a very difficult person to summarize, and if you find him as interesting as I do, I highly recommend checking out some biographies of him for a fuller history. Theodore Roosevelt holds a place in history as one of the most unique and dynamic men in American politics, and he was an incredibly important figure in the history of New York State. He was born October 27, 1858 in New York City. As an adult, Roosevelt was well known for his physical fitness and his sense of adventure, but he spent his childhood sickly and ill, and spent a lot of time in his family's home being homeschooled. He ended up developing a physical fitness routine involving weightlifting and boxing. Roosevelt attended Harvard and Columbia Law School, but ended up leaving school early to join the New York State Assembly as a representative from New York City, the youngest to serve in such a capacity. So this was the start of a life spent largely in public service, and Roosevelt went on to become captain of the National Guard and minority leader of the New York Assembly. After the deaths of his mother and wife on the same day in 1884, Roosevelt departed for the Dakota Territory and spent 2 years as a cowboy and cattle rancher. He returned to political life in 1886 and ran unsuccessfully for New York City mayor. He married for a second time and became Civil Service Commissioner and then New York City Police Commissioner, and finally Assistant U.S. Navy Secretary serving under President William McKinley. At the onset of the Spanish-American War in 1898, Roosevelt left his government post to found a volunteer cavalry called the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders saw action in the Battle of San Juan Hill, and Roosevelt was nominated for the Medal of Honor. Although he was blocked by Army officials from winning it at the time, he was given it posthumously over 100 years later in 2001 by then-President Bill Clinton. Roosevelt ran for and was elected governor of New York in 1898. We'll look at his governorship through the lens of his work for New York Canals a little later. This stereo card shows the Rough Riders departing Tampa, Florida, and bound for Santiago de Cuba. Roosevelt's rising political star and progressivism was seen as a detriment by the Republican Party, who sought to neutralize him by running him with William McKinley as McKinley's vice president for his re-election campaign in 1900. Vice president was supposed to be sort of a political dead end, but then McKinley was assassinated at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York on September 6, 1901. So this move backfired just a little bit. McKinley eventually died from his wounds on September 14th, and Roosevelt was thrust into the presidency. He took the oath of office at the Ansley Wilcox House in Buffalo to become the 26th president of the United States and the youngest ever to assume office at the age of 42. Roosevelt served the remainder of the second term McKinley had been elected to and was re-elected November 8, 1904, and then left office for good March 4, 1909. He did run again as a candidate for the Progressive Party, also known as the Bull Moose Party, in 1912, competing against his hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft, and Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson. Due to splitting that vote, Roosevelt lost to Wilson, but his performance was the most successful of any third-party candidate in history. After the presidency, the remainder of Roosevelt's life was consumed with continued attempts at political office and also exploring Africa, Europe, and South America, both as an informal ambassador and a big-game hunter. He died on January 6, 1919, at the age of 60, and he really lived those 60 years. During his nearly 7.5 years as the president, Roosevelt transformed the American presidency and became one of the most memorable of the men to occupy the highest office. Roosevelt's domestic policies were characterized by the notion of the square deal, a fair shake for the American people. This involved increasing regulations on big business and breaking up monopolies such as the Northern Securities Company, which was a railroad trust. He even established a cabinet department to expand upon this effort, the short-lived U.S. Department of Commerce and Labor. He helped to negotiate the end of the coal strike in 1902, and in the area of consumer protection, Roosevelt pushed Congress to pass the 1906 Meat Inspection Act and Pure Food and Drug Act to force transparency in food and drug labeling laws and increase safety for American consumers. He worked tirelessly to advocate the cause of resource and wildlife conservation, chartering national parks, establishing animal preserves, and creating the U.S. Forestry Service. But it was Roosevelt's New World foreign policy initiatives that resulted in the creation of the Panama Canal. Roosevelt is perhaps best known for his big stick diplomacy, as exemplified by the adage, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far." Incidentally, Roosevelt attributed this notion to a West African proverb, but no reference has ever been found to this phrase prior to his use of it in a letter in 1900 when he was governor of New York. He may even have coined the phrase himself. Whatever its origin, this little motto became the cornerstone of Roosevelt's foreign policy. He described it as the exercise of intelligent forethought and of decisive action sufficiently far in advance of any likely crisis, and it had 5 components. A serious military capability to command attention and respect, just action toward other nations, no bluffing, strike only when prepared to strike hard, and have a willingness to allow your adversary to save face in defeat. In short, this meant striving for peaceful negotiation with the strength to back it up, just in case. So how did this work in practice, relating to American foreign relations in Central and South America and subsequently the construction of the Panama Canal? Theodore Roosevelt was also known in history as being an unapologetic imperialist. He was a complicated man. In the aftermath of the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt saw the advantages in growing America's influence in the world. These ideas led to the Roosevelt Corollary, which was an addition to the older Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, for those who might have slept through high school American history class, was the policy of opposing European colonialism in the Americas. It was articulated in 1823 by then-President James Monroe, although the policy was actually authored by John Quincy Adams, who was Secretary of State. At this time, almost all of the Latin American colonies previously taken by Spain and Portugal had either achieved independence or were nearly independent from those empires. Per this doctrine, any further efforts by European nations to take control of any independent state in North or South America would be viewed as, quote, the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States. The stated objective of the Monroe Doctrine was to keep Latin America free of European meddling and intervention and avoid making the New World a place for old world powers to assert their influence. This, of course, did not preclude the United States from asserting its own influence in the New World, and this was just the direction that the Roosevelt Corollary went in the early 20th century. It was articulated by Theodore Roosevelt in his 1904 State of the Union address after the Venezuela crisis of 1902 to 1903. In a nutshell, Venezuela was blockaded by Britain, Germany, and Italy after refusing to pay foreign debts occurred in their civil war. An international court ruled that those nations were entitled to preferential treatment in the payment of their claims against Venezuela. Other nations, such as the United States, were also owed by Venezuela but did not take military action. They were left with no recourse. It was thought that this decision would encourage European intervention in the future to get this advantage. In order to prevent this, the Roosevelt Corollary stated that the United States has the right to intervene in order to stabilize the economic affairs of small states in the Caribbean and Central America if they were unable to pay their international debts. This was both an addition to and a departure from the Monroe Doctrine, further pushing European powers out of the New World, but also asserting the United States to be sort of a police force for the New World. This strategy did not last for long after the end of Roosevelt's presidency. Presidents after him, including Calvin Coolidge and Franklin Roosevelt, disavowed his corollary. The corollary did come into play in American relations with Panama during Theodore Roosevelt's tenure in office. The idea of a canal to link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans went back a few centuries to the early 16th century, when Balboa first crossed the North and South American Isthmus. This narrow land bridge connects the two continents and was recognized for its potential. Prior to the creation of a canal, if you wanted to sail from the Atlantic to the Pacific, ships had to navigate around Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America. Traveling from New York to San Francisco covered 13,000 miles and took about 6 months. By the 19th century, technology had advanced enough to make this project a more realistic possibility, and we already know that canals were having a moment in the 19th century. Canal building in Europe, as well as the construction of the Erie Canal and lateral canals in New York and then in the eastern United States and Midwest, comprised a veritable canal mania. President Ulysses S. Grant had even sent 7 expeditions down to study the feasibility of a canal during his time in office a few decades before Roosevelt. So clearly this was an idea whose time really had come. But where should you put such an ambitious project? At the end of the 19th century, there were 2 places being considered, Nicaragua and Panama. At the time, Panama was a rebellious district within the country of Colombia. The U.S. Congress established the Isthmian Canal Commission in 1899, coming on the heels of another commission focused solely on the Nicaragua option to determine the most practical and feasible route for such a canal to take. Boy, if you want to float some ideas, establish a commission. Both commissions recommended Nicaragua, due in part to the failed attempts by the French to create a canal through Panama. The famed canal engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps led the initial attempt by France, but this project was not to be. Costs skyrocketed as the terrain was vastly underestimated. The land was rugged, tropical diseases ran rampant, and there was massive political corruption around the financing of the effort. The resulting canal was only partially completed, and now the United States had the opportunity to purchase the project. The Colombian government wasn't in favor of the U.S. continuing the canal, thereby leading to the consideration of Nicaragua instead. The politics around this project needed to be changed, and French engineer and financier Philippe Jean Bunau Varilla went to work. He owned a massive stake in the French Canal Company and was positioned to make a large profit on his investment if the Panama Canal could be completed. He lobbied U.S. lawmakers and helped to foment an existing independence movement among the Panamanian people. The upshot of these efforts was a revolution. The Panama Canal project served as a catalyst for an already tenuous connection between Colombia and Panama. Panama had joined the Confederation of Gran Colombia, which included present-day nations of Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela, along with part of Peru, Guyana, and Brazil, after declaring their independence from Spain in 1821. But Panama was far from the government in Bogota and had no practical overland connection to the rest of the Confederation. Panama had flirted briefly with independence from 1840 to 1841, but then later rejoined the Confederation. By the turn of the 20th century, Colombia was mired in the civil conflict of the Thousand Days' War, and the stalled work on the French Canal project left separatists angling for independence. Negotiations with Colombia for the American takeover of the canal project broke down in 1903, and the United States moved to support the separatist movement, officially recognizing the independence of Panama in November 1903. This was followed by the signing of the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty on November 18, 1903, by the U.S. and Panama. This treaty established the Panama Canal Zone and the subsequent construction of the Panama Canal, and was named after its two primary negotiators, Philippe Jean Bunau Varilla and United States Secretary of State John Hay. And here's a little political cartoon summarizing these events of 1903. So now that we know more about TR himself, as well as his ideas of domestic and foreign policy and the background of American intervention in the Panama Canal project, it's time for us to circle back and talk about the modern New York State canal system as it was constructed concurrently with the Panama Canal. This canal is more popularly known as the Barge Canal, especially among New Yorkers. Here's the 19th century Enlarged Canal as it ran through Syracuse. At the end of the 19th century, the Enlarged Canal was in competition with larger and more modern canals in the St. Lawrence River, which would later be incorporated into the St. Lawrence Seaway in the early 1950s. An ill-fated attempt to deepen the existing Enlarged Canal by 2 feet and raise the existing bridges was begun in 1895. This was the $9 million improvement. And as it turned out, $9 million was not enough, even if the work had gone as predicted. Dishonest contractors were skimming off the project, and the work was halted at the end of 1897, with less than 2/3 of the work actually completed. Unfortunately, this catastrophe cast suspicion on those involved with the canal, and it ended up only being partially deepened. The idea for a ship canal was also being floated, get it, in the late 19th century, and Roosevelt was elected New York governor in 1898. The federal government had created the Deep Waterway Survey in 1897 to examine the feasibility of the creation of a larger ship canal across the state. This would provide a competitor for the railroads and keep their shipping rates down. Many New York-based businesses were in favor of this plan, particularly shippers in Buffalo and in New York City, who believed that keeping the shipping of goods such as steel and grain completely within the United States, and especially New York, would greatly benefit them. There was also a national security concern prompted by the recent Spanish-American War. It was safer to keep shipping entirely within the United States. The Deep Waterway Survey concluded that a deeper ship canal would not be as useful for New York as a smaller and shallower barge canal would be. This finding was also echoed by one Thomas William Simons, a noted engineer whose previous projects included planning and constructing the world's longest breakwater, which was over 4 miles long, on the shores of Buffalo. In 1898, Roosevelt had assigned Simons to survey and report on the potential project. His plan was to run the canal across the state, thereby addressing concerns for national security. Roosevelt stated that it would be folly not to utilize the topographical advantages of New York State, including the presence of the best water route for shipping, as a supplement for growing railroads. New York would lose the shipping advantage if it turned to depend solely on railroads. $101 million was appropriated for canal improvements via a bond issue. After much back and forth and extensive lobbying for both sides, the voters agreed in November 1903 with 3/4 of the over 1 million votes cast in favor of the project. The victory was won heavily in both New York City and Western New York. No surprise there. People had decided in favor of large-scale canal improvements and the transportation of 1,000-ton barges across the state. The cost of this project would nearly match the amount spent on construction and maintenance of the 19th century canals. Constructing a canal in the 20th century was in some ways different from constructing one in the 19th century, but in other ways much the same. The work officially began on the Champlain Canal at Fort Miller in April of 1905, and the entire length of the new system, 524 miles, was fully open to traffic on May 15, 1918. Work was performed by contractors, like the earlier canals, with the work divided so different companies could bid on different parts of it. This freed the state from having to hire and manage the vast workforce necessary for the project. More than 200 contracts were awarded for building machinery, digging miles of canal, and dredging rivers to be canalized, and in addition, nearly 200 more contracts were awarded for the construction of terminals. These varied in fees. $6,090 for building a road bridge over the canal at Little Falls, all the way up to $1 million for locks 34 and 35 at Lockport. There were even contracts awarded for relocating grave sites in the route of the canal. As in the 19th century canal's enlargement period, much of the work was done by immigrant laborers who were housed in labor camps and not paid very much. A dredge captain might make $5 a day, a stonemason $4, but a water boy only 91 cents a day. So here's a photo of some engineers that worked on the project. I think this photo was actually taken in the Syracuse Waylock building, which is today home of the Erie Canal Museum. The work went on concurrently at many different sites. The new canal would follow part of the enlarged canal's route and also break new ground, along with following natural waterways, including the Mohawk River, Oneida Lake, and the Oswego River. A major difference in the barge canal's construction was the materials and machines used. Concrete was a new innovation, and over 3 million cubic yards of it was used. The cut stone masonry of the 19th century canals didn't look much different from a lot of older structures, but the barge canal structures definitely looked stronger, smoother, and more modern. Steam shovels and dredging machinery were used, and of course these were not around in the 19th century, so the work was now mechanized. Before we move on to the construction challenges of the Panama Canal, I want to tell you a little bit about Frank Williams, the New York State engineer who supervised the Barge Canal project for over half of the years of its construction. He served 5 two-year terms as state engineer, first elected in 1908 at the age of 34, and was at the forefront of important canal issues, such as the construction of structures on and adjacent to the canal and the addition of a Cayuga-Seneca branch. He was a strong advocate for the Barge Canal even after its completion, and lamented that the Barge Canal didn't reach its full potential under federal control during World War I. On May 10, 1918, Williams wielded a small shovel and ceremoniously removed the last earth barrier on the west bank of the Genesee River south of Rochester to allow the flow of water into the canal. His task was finished with an excavating machine, of course. So the museum actually has the shovel in our collection, and here it is. As you can see, it's got a little bitty inscription plate on the handle. I'm going to read that to you, don't worry. This is the shovel with which state engineer Frank M. Williams removed the last barrier to through navigation on New York State's new Barge Canal. Ceremony took place at Genesee Valley Park, Rochester, on Friday, May 10, 1918. This shovel was presented to the state engineer at a banquet celebrating the official opening of the new canal on May 15, 1918. Meanwhile, in Panama, so you already know about the political background and history of the Panama Canal project, so let's learn more about how it was constructed and finally finished. The U.S. takeover happened officially May 4, 1904. The French work on the project to the point of the American takeover had been just preparations, largely. The project was managed by U.S. Army engineers after a brief back and forth about whether contractors or engineers should be used. Roosevelt initially preferred contractors and then later appointed George Washington Goethals to administer and supervise in February of 1907. Goethals was the state engineer of New Jersey and the acting quartermaster general of the U.S. Army. He was recommended by then Secretary of War William Howard Taft. The work was divided in similar fashion to New York canals, with the high-level engineering and skilled labor jobs going to white Americans and the manual labor going to immigrants. They initially came from Europe and were often political refugees, but later workers were recruited from the British and French West Indies. So here is a photo of William Howard Taft, who is, of course, the gentleman on the left, and the engineers on the canal project in 1909. That's Goethals to Taft's upper right. Conditions in the canal zone weren't great for workers, with a preponderance of saloons for entertainment and very little else. Other facilities were soon added, including clubhouses with recreation facilities, and dances and trips to baseball games were facilitated, helping to improve their lives somewhat. Tropical diseases such as yellow fever and malaria had been a major problem during the French years, and over 22,000 people had died. When the Americans took over the project, sanitation was their very first concern, and large-scale efforts were undertaken to eliminate disease-carrying mosquitoes from the canal zone. However, the mosquito theory of disease was still controversial and regarded as unproven at this time, so you can appreciate this move as being revolutionary. The work focused on making areas uninhabitable for mosquitoes, including eliminating areas where standing water could collect and spreading oil over standing water surfaces that couldn't be removed. Swamps and wetlands were drained and filled, and domestic water systems were installed in urban areas. Quinine was used to combat malaria, and sick workers were kept quarantined. Workers slept in tented verandas to keep mosquitoes out. And finally, fumigation was used on a large scale to treat areas where Panamanians were found to have contracted yellow fever. As has been far too often the case in history, racism played a role in these sanitation and medical efforts. Free medical care was provided for all the workers, but black canal laborers were not given housing the way white workers were, and so were forced to live outside the mosquito-controlled zone. As fellow students of American history, this really shouldn't surprise any of you, and it didn't surprise me. In the end, 350 white workers died as compared to 4,500 black workers. In the year 1906, only one case of yellow fever was reported, and after that, no more cases during the construction period. Even to this day, the Panama Canal Zone is regarded as malaria and yellow fever free. Work itself was arduous, and it was completed in 3 divisions: Atlantic, Central, and Pacific. One of the biggest hurdles was the Continental Divide, which originally rose to 360 feet above sea level at its highest point. This rock barrier had to be cut through, and it was to become the Collabre Cut. 6,000 men worked on this, drilling holes in which to place 27,000 tons of dynamite to break up the rock, which was then removed by train. The dotted line on this postcard image indicates how much earth was removed during the cut. The USS Michigan passing through the Collabre Cut once completed. 2 artificial lakes were created to be part of the canal, Gatun and Miraflores. 4 dams were built to create them. There are 2 small dams at Miraflores and a dam at Pedro Miguel, which encloses the south end of the Collabre Cut. The Gatun Dam is the main dam blocking the original course of the Chagres River, which created Gatun Lake. There are 12 locks in total on the Panama Canal in 3 sets. There is a 2-step flight of locks at Miraflores and a single flight at Pedro Miguel, which lifts ships from the Pacific up to Gatun Lake. These are the Miraflores locks by moonlight. Then there is a triple flight of locks at Gatun that lowers them to the Atlantic side. All 3 sets of locks are paired, so there are 2 parallel flights of locks at each of the 3 lock sites. The idea here was to allow ships to pass in opposite directions simultaneously, but large ships can't cross safely at speed in the Collabre Cut, so they are used one direction at a time. This postcard shows construction of the upper lock at Gatun. And the Gatun locks looking north. Those are enormous. I've been through Erie Canal locks, and these are huge. Panama Canal was finished near the end of 1913 and officially opened on August 15, 1914. Its navigable length is only 50 miles. The SS Cristobal was the first ship to transit the canal from ocean to ocean on August 3, 1914. The American cost of the project was almost $500 million, and it was the largest American engineering project to that date. The targeted finish date was June 10, 1916. How often does a project like this get finished early? Interestingly enough, the progress of the Barge Canal was compared to Panama at the time. In 1908, a chart in the Barge Canal Bulletin showed that the 2 excavated about the same amount of material each year. So both the Barge Canal and the Panama Canal still exist today, of course. The Barge Canal has become a shadow of its former importance, however. In 1946, New York Governor Thomas Dewey began the New York State Thruway Project, making comparisons to the Erie Canal. The Thruway has taken a lot of the commercial and passenger traffic across the state that the canal had seen prior to its creation. Barge Canal's name was changed officially to the New York State Canal System in 1992 and placed under the newly created New York State Canal Corporation. No significant modernization has occurred since the 1970s due to that march of progress and takeover of truck transport for commercial goods. These days it sees much more recreational traffic than business traffic, and a lot of people still come to New York to see our canals. They come from all over the country and all over the world. So here are some kayakers enjoying a lovely day on the canal at Waterford. In the decades following the completion of the Panama Canal, the politics surrounding it became contentious, and there were calls for exclusively Panamanian ownership of the waterway. Relations really did break down in the 1970s, and eventually President Jimmy Carter and Panamanian leader Omar Torrijos negotiated the control of the canal. The Torrijos-Carter treaties were signed September 7, 1977. They granted Panama free control of the canal after the year 1999, as long as Panama signed a treaty guaranteeing the canal's permanent neutrality. Full Panamanian control of the canal was assumed at noon on December 31, 1999. Boy, they really waited till the last minute. And the canal is still one of the chief revenue sources for Panama. It still sees a lot of commercial traffic and has been enlarged and improved upon several times in its over 100 years of operation. People travel from all over the world to see this modern wonder. When I was very young, I remember my grandparents going on a cruise and getting to pass through the Panama Canal. They received special certificates after the passage and had them framed and displayed on their den wall. The internet was really helpful in finding an example of what these look like. I'm almost positive that it was a princess cruise that my grandparents took, too. So here's an image of the Gatun locks, an aerial photo from 2014. It's really quite impressive. So thank you for joining me today to learn more about Theodore Roosevelt and the 2 canals that he influenced. These 2 projects had major impacts on American and world history, and the fact that they are still in use today speaks volumes about the importance of TR and his domestic and foreign policies. So I'm going to leave you today with one of my favorite palindromes. A man, a plan, a canal. Panama. So thank you guys so much. Like I said, our museum is still closed to the public because of COVID-19. If you'd like to support us at this time, we would be forever grateful to you. See the link below. Thanks, and stay healthy.